Good evening. My name is Ann Birch, and I am happy to welcome you to this second night and third event in our 2021 Dillard Forum featuring Dr. Charles Gillespie and his theme of theology and theater. Last night, we got our feet wet, or maybe this afternoon, with his talk entitled, "There's No Business Like Show Business, Spectacles and Christian Theology." We had a lively hour in a Zoom session at noon today, which came to an abrupt end when the internet in the church went down temporarily. But before that, Dr. Gillespie ably answered a lot of questions that were put to him. We can consider that last question that was posted and his partial answer a cliffhanger, so stay tuned. In the second act of As You Like It, William Shakespeare has his character, Jacques, start a monologue with the phrase, "All the world's a stage." Actors on a stage are watched and listened to just as all of us are in life. Someone on the Zoom gathering today noted that we could consider God as our audience, and if so, the connection between our performance, our behavior, and how we live out our faith is clear. Charlie, you're opening our eyes. The title of tonight's topic is You Will Be Found, Thinking About God on Broadway. At the end of the lecture, Dr. Gillespie will again answer questions from our audience here in the sanctuary or from those submitted online by our viewers who are streaming this program. And now I give you Dr. Charles Gillespie.
Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted and amazed to see so many people back for a second round on a Monday evening, no less, on a day that had near apocalyptic rain. As I said yesterday, I'm delighted that you're here, whether you're joining us in our live sanctuary audience or whether you're with us on the live stream online. Thank you so much for being here. Concept album, Jesus Christ Superstar, premiered as a stage musical on Broadway. There were interreligious protests. In fact, there were picket lines at every premiere of Jesus Christ Superstar, whether in New York, London, or even in Belfast in Northern Ireland. Groups of Catholics and Protestants came together and took issue with the musical's overly human depictions of the Lord, its sympathies with Judas Iscariot, and of course, Jesus Christ Superstar's strong implication that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were more than just close friends. Some reports highlight how members of the Jewish community also joined the picket lines, worried that Superstar might reignite anti-Semitic stereotypes. These differing communities might not agree about the right way to worship God, but they were able to come together in order to reject a Broadway spectacle like Jesus Christ Superstar. And yet, there were reports that Pope Paul VI opined that it might bring more people to Christianity than anything that had come before. And the tabloid Page 6 printed a delicious headline back in 2014 that Pope Francis fangirls over Jesus Christ Superstar when the current pontiff went to take in the show in Rome and even stayed after to bless the cast back in 2014. God certainly grabs our attention in a Broadway show. But should we be worried about laughing at God? As Anne mentioned, our Zoom session earlier today was cut short to a bit of divine intervention manifesting in the form of an internet outage. I'll leave it to you to figure out if that was whether we were delivered from evil or it was a justified act of God's wrath against me. But the question on the table was, are there wicked shows that we should refuse to continue to watch? We also had a question last night about the show that I'm always asked about when I do talks about God and Broadway, the Book of Mormon. What do we make of this patently offensive show? Indeed, the Book of Mormon has a joke at pretty much everyone's expense. Right now, the company of the Book of Mormon on Broadway is spending time integrating changes to the script because of its treatment of its African characters. The musical and its directors and writers have realized as culture has changed in its sense of what sort of stories we're willing to tell, even this show might need to be edited a bit to make sure that its jokes are still joy-filled rather than hate-filled. The musical raises questions about how we should negotiate the fuzzy lines between satire and sacrilege, hilarity and harm, laughing with and laughing at. So I ask you, what do you see in the Book of Mormon logo? The show is all about stereotypes, after all, so what do we already think we know about it based on its advertisement? You might see that there's a missionary who's excited. We see that the missionary seems to be white. We see that there are visible props and costumes, like a book, a tie, a name tag. There's, of course, that crucially important ding-dong doorbell, and the title of the musical, The Book of Mormon. This is actually a show about two kinds of books. On the one hand, a holy book, the Book of Mormon, held sacred by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but also the so-called book musical, a thoroughly American invention that traces its origin to Oklahoma in 1941. Perhaps the most significant religious musical on Broadway remains the Book of Mormon. When Ben Brantley, the New York Times theater critic, praised this musical as a soaring, excoriating tribute to the book musical and to religious belief, Brantley identifies that one of the play's central conceits seems to put religious stories on similar footing to other kinds of pop culture myths and mythologies. The show makes frequent references to Disney films and the history of American musical theater. The number, Joseph Smith, American Moses, parodies the House of Uncle Thomas pageant in Rodgers and Hammerstein's The King and I. You and Me, but Mostly Me, makes note-for-note musical citations to a number from Wicked called The Wizard and I. The number I Am Africa in Act 2 not only has a joke about Bono, but also features choreography from the dance sequences of Disney's The Lion King. The structure of the Book of Mormon is a near-perfect book musical, and its brand of bright, sunny religious satire recalls Mel Brooks's hit The Producers. The musical brings Rodgers and Hammerstein's sense of what a musical is supposed to be, happiness and light, to bear on a critique of multiple kinds of hypocrisy. It seems to say that Broadway can do what religious communities try to do, but actually do it better. Broadway can raise religious questions of ultimate concern that hear and respond to objections to faith based on evil, suffering, and violence. And finally, Broadway can actually point out its audience's own religious hypocrisy. For instance, in the musical, the land of glory and wonder for Elder Price, this favorite slice of God's kingdom, is Orlando, Florida. The Orlando, Orlando, I love you, Orlando theme returns again and again to signal that Elder Price equates religious feeling with Disneyfied escapism. Religion, in some sense, seems to be childhood narratives of deliverance from evil, family fun, granted wishes, dreams that come true. In fact, a dream comes true when these two missionaries receive their mission. Africa will be just like Lion King. This musical works off stereotypes, and a major plot device, the one the cast is currently reconsidering, depends on our stereotypes of Africa as an undeveloped and primitive continent. As satire, the musical attempts to address horror with jokes. But this doesn't exonerate the Book of Mormon from the charge of its offensiveness. The show relies on stereotypes to make a point, And it does so by purposefully rendering laugh lines from unspeakable sexual violence against women and children, AIDS, malnutrition, political violence, racism, colonialism, and Orientalism. In addition, the play intones and performs acts of blasphemy that impugn and curse God. But I wonder if we might also take those acts of blasphemy, not putting aside the show's potential offensiveness, but to see if it's asking a religious question in a different way from how we might do so in a church space like this one. Upon arrival in Uganda, we meet the show's African characters in the Book of Mormon's own send-up version of the Lion King's Hakuna Matata. Elders Price and Cunningham are thrilled to participate in this song and dance number welcoming them. I won't quote the English version of the song's explicit lyrics because they are unsettling, blasphemous, and deeply problematic, particularly were I to say them out loud in this holy space. But I want to argue that the entire number motivates a single moment where the dancing stops, the light and the music cut, and the company of dancing villagers and Mormon missionaries turns to directly address the audience in a moment of theological confrontation. If you don't like what we say, try living here a couple days. Watch all your friends and family die. Hasadiga Ibawai. The musical indicts its audience as mirrored in Elders Price and Cunningham. Why do American believers become more offended at speech acts of profanity against the divine than they do at ordinary political acts that cause such profound and material suffering? Similarly, I think this moment might be correlated with other tiny moments across the show to suggest that the Book of Mormon valorizes a kind of protest prayer rather than a rejection of God altogether. A shocking number of references to the symbol of God can be found across this art form we call Broadway theater. From overt religious symbols in the form of characters offering prayers, celebrating sacraments, or even that avalanche of nuns. There are plays and musicals that are drawn from biblical source material, like Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, Children of Eden, or Godspell. And you should actually check out a great book by the scholar Henry Byle called Playing God that describes all of the Broadway shows that take scripture as its source material. Clearly, Broadway producers and Broadway audiences are both interested in telling religious stories, often drawing on the same source material as the church. Do Broadway shows interpret scripture properly? Yesterday, we worked hard together to figure out how we can look for God on Broadway. We talked about the technical relationship between theology and theater by means of an important word, spectacle. I reviewed some of the long-standing Christian critiques of theater and performance, and as you might recall, the early Christians worried that theater encourages a kind of demonic flirtation with lies and deceit. Rather than focus on the love of God and neighbor, theatrical stories can train us to love illusion and pleasure for its own sake. Theology needs to be aware of the ways that spectacle can distract and distort. But in the end, I suggested that spectacles might mean more for us than initially meets the eye. In fact, spectacle might be one of the ways that God grabs our attention and shows us the meaning of divine love in an event that changes the world. I ended my talk yesterday with what I hoped was a provocative claim that the contemporary church needs to take spectacle more seriously as a part of its understanding of God, not in terms of spectacle as something offensive or distracting, but in terms of how God reveals God's self to us. That is, Christians too often underestimate the power of spectacle in popular entertainment and so dismiss it. Broadway shows are not serious art. Rather than interpret the wondrous sights and captivating stories as vehicles for God's self-revelation, Christians employ weak versions of the old anti-theatrical bias we talked about yesterday. That idea, you might recall, can be found in the ancient Greeks as well as the early church fathers. I like to call it performance anxiety, the worry that imitation turns attention away from the real and towards something fake. Spectacles and entertainment are just unreal fakery. Theater sometimes represents the high art of hypocrisy, an empty show. We see sometimes what we see is not what we get. The theme is nothing new for Broadway, after all. There's that wonderful story of a girl from Kansas who winds up in a green city where she's told, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. You see, the show distracts from what's real. But in the later musical Wicked, there's a delightful number where the Wizard of Oz says to Elphaba, the Wicked Witch of the West, in a concern that he might be lying to the people of Oz, he responds, well, Elphaba, where I come from, we believe all sorts of things that aren't true. It's called history. A man's called a traitor or liberator. A rich man's a thief or philanthropist. Is one a crusader or ruthless invader? It's all in which label is able to persist. There are precious few at ease with moral ambiguities, so we act as though they don't exist. They call me wonderful, etc., etc., etc. Oh, I even got some applause from someone. That was amazing. It was off-key and a cappella, and I lost my nerve to do the tap dance. We'll see if it comes back later. Speaking of myself, perhaps I should look at the specks in my own perception before turning to talk about the plank in the perception of others. Because that's what the wizard's whole song is about, isn't it? It's being perceived as wonderful. I'm obligated to say here that my reflections on theater and theology throughout this entire Dillard Forum come from one rather particular and embodied perspective. There are other ways to configure and reconfigure the relationship between God and the stage. Some of the most obvious include my personal decision to treat theology as a Christian practice oriented towards interpreting and seeking understanding about the God revealed in and through Jesus the Christ. But the mix of theater and theology means something quite different if we're in ancient Athens encountering stories of the gods at the theater of Dionysus, or if we're even those Roman citizens we talked about yesterday going to the gladiatorial games. There are rich traditions of Jewish, Islamic, and Hindu, and even expressly atheistic theater. Incredible performance happens all around the world according to expectations for the stage very different from the European model that we've inherited in the United States and often assume to be a theatrical norm. My cultural situation influences the sorts of theater and performance I like, or I've chosen to talk about with you all tonight. But my embodied perspective also includes my own social and ecclesial locations, influenced, refracted, and distorted by my participations in whiteness, masculinity, Roman Catholicism, steady employment, suburban homeownership in the Northeast, my partnership in marriage to my spouse, Tara, my American citizenship, my large but relatively able body with its own quirks and chronic conditions, and my history, my time spent making theater. That wasn't simply a rundown of some demographic markers of my identity so you could fill out the census form for me next time. They were the ways that my perception of the world and of God have been shaped differently from someone else's perception of the world and of God. I say all this because studying God and studying theater both demand that attention be paid to the body. Humans can't perceive anything apart from their embodied perception. In fact, humans can't perceive anything without a body. At least, I've yet to meet a human being that doesn't have a body. If you are here tonight, please talk to me afterwards, because I would love to get to know you. It's because theology, as we said, it's a human endeavor. And we humans are finite creatures that can only see things from our perspective. The image of theater, then, can be quite instructive for theologians, because there are different vantage points on the same reality available in the house. That's theater lingo for the audience. Everyone who goes to a show sees the same show, no matter where they sit. Maybe this point needs a little illumination. Consider one of the most famous tourist attractions in New York City or London or whenever a touring company comes to a theater near you. That's right, the chandelier from the mega musical The Phantom of the Opera. A recent New York Times story explains how they got the chandelier effect back up and running after COVID-19. It actually took a little while to get the gears and the system ready to go to welcome audiences safely once again. But think about the experience of that falling chandelier. Has anyone seen a production of Phantom of the Opera before? A couple of people. If you've never seen Phantom of the Opera, please believe me, there is a chandelier, and it does something. I won't spoil it for you about why or when, but it falls. And the experience of the falling chandelier must be different depending on where you sit. Think about it. If you're in the cheap seats, way up top, you look down on the falling chandelier. Part of your experience of Phantom of the Opera is to have a perspective that's similar to the Phantom's. You get to watch all the people in the fancy seats cowering in fear that their overly priced ticket to sit in the orchestra might also come with an evening in the ER. If you are one of the people that have paid for the choice seats down in front, part of your experience of the show is to look up to see a chandelier come hurtling towards you. It's very different depending on where you sit, right? Here's my question. Who saw the real show? The one looking down or the one looking up? The answer is all of the above. I think that the anti-theatrical bias, that idea from Plato that imitation necessarily distorts reality, makes it hard for us to take seriously that where we sit influences what we see. Theater demands space for many different interpretations that reflect different ways that humans perceive the world. I'm intrigued by that line of thinking because I think it connects a little bit to what we talked about yesterday with show business. Theatrical analogies invite us to talk about the world as a stage for salvation history, like that wonderful speech from As You Like It that Anne quoted earlier. Theatrical analogies let us come to see that God is not only some aloof author of the script for history, but is also an actor that joins the drama and performs goodness in tangible ways. In the Christ, we come to know our God to be one who understands what it means to play a human role, what it means to love, have friends, suffer loss, experience pain, even learning lessons, and a God who teaches us how to live our human life more beautifully. Maybe we can even understand creation as a part of God's ongoing show, the world that exists in radical dependence on the Creator who loves it into being. There's a Latin phrase for this idea about God, that God continuously creates the world. The Latin phrase is creatio continua. God doesn't make things up in some distant past, but continually loves the world into being. Every moment of the show depends on God to keep it going. This reminds us a little bit of something that's known as a theory of performativity, a theory that says that being and doing are one and the same. The fancy term for the way I like to think about history as God's ongoing show might be a performative ontology, but we don't need that kind of fancy language because we know it from Broadway shows. They help us imagine that God needs to be a constant and dynamic presence in our life. And it prepares us to imagine how being and doing might continue for all eternity, because God is love. The phrase, God is love is God, formed the backdrop to a performance of the musical Godspell that I saw at the Berkshire Theater Group in Massachusetts back in August of 2020. Do y'all know Godspell? I mentioned it yesterday. It's this wonderful version of the Gospel of Matthew that comes to life with a community of disciples singing songs about their relationship to Jesus. Between the musical numbers, you hear some of the great parables and some of the lessons from the Gospel of Matthew with the parable of the prodigal son and the story and another story from Luke also thrown in, the Good Samaritan. The production I saw in the Berkshires was the very first musical that was permitted by the Actors Union, Actors Equity, to be performed during the pandemic. As a result, the actors formed a bubble for rehearsals. There were special rules about how close they could be on stage. When actors passed each other with fewer than 6 feet, they put a mask on. And the set, in front of this notion that God is love, is God, were these plexiglass barriers so the company could sing and feel safe while doing so. I'm intrigued by the fact that the first musical to be performed in an equity production during the pandemic was Godspell. I think it tells us two things. On the one hand, it reminds us that Godspell is a great choice because though we have this 70s assumption that's a very sort of hippie performance with everyone hugging and being close together, structurally, it's a revue, and no one needs to touch throughout the entire show. It tapped into something wonderful and heartbreaking about what it might mean to follow Jesus at a distance. On the other hand, though, this production did a number of interesting choices. Godspell very famously begins with a sequence known as the Tower of Babel, where various philosophers and thinkers from history tell their story in a cacophony of sound. For this production, the actors stepped out on stage, playing themselves, and addressed the audience directly, sharing with the audience their experience of lockdown in March of 2020, whether they lost their first big break because theaters closed, whether they were afraid of being able to see family again. And other members of the company talked about the experience of a racial awakening in the United States in the wake of the death of George Floyd. What does it mean to perform in our culture in light of the world in which we live? The production made choices to suggest that the Romans were police looking to execute someone extrajudiciously. And the performance raised questions about what it means to be together. So the great vaudeville number, All for the Best, instead of with canes and top hats, was performed with meter sticks and Lysol. It was a wonderful, wonderful, hilarious sense of that which we came to value so much early in the pandemic. But the production made a number of interesting choices that left me wanting a bit more. And that's because it would seem that the symbol of God was just a vehicle to talk about a human experience. That's not a bad thing, but it suggests that the intent of the creators of this production of Godspell was not to sing glory and praise to the Lord, not to take hymns from a hymnal and turn them into Broadway show tunes. If you ever see a production of Godspell, you should know that a full 1/3 of the numbers are just pulled straight from hymns that were very popular in the United States in the late 19th century. But the show, nonetheless, was a beautiful, beautiful tribute to theater and even to God. And I'm curious what we make of that fact, that it's pretty abundantly clear that the symbol of God used in this production was in no way intended by its creators to be religious or faithful. Can we learn something about God nonetheless? Or do we need to be anxious about this performance? Do we need to assume that just because the producers were more interested in telling a story that fit well for COVID restrictions than staging the gospel for the sake of winning converts to Christ? Is there a reason we need to assume then that the spectacle was fake? Who am I, actually, to assume that the actors on stage didn't intend this to be a beautiful theological reading of Godspell and showing the meaning of feeling abandoned, to be present in our lives during the pandemic? In fact, there are plenty of spectacles that are true and spectacular at the same time. We talked about that a little yesterday. I like to remind folks, fireworks are not lying to you just because they're spectacular. It's the same way in which we might talk about the spectacle of a funeral procession with flashing hazard lights, or even the spectacle of a grand wedding or a graduation ceremony with their pomp and circumstance. It's interesting, then, that we see spectacles that do things in the world all the time. But what happens when those spectacles that have a certain set of meanings when they're intended to migrate to the stage, where the intention seems to be telling a story, having fun, We do have to start asking some fun theological questions about whether Maria and Captain Von Trapp need to file their divorce paperwork after every Saturday matinee in order to be ready to get married again that night at 8 p.m. The actress playing Elle Woods in the musical Legally Blonde does not suddenly possess a Harvard law degree because at the end of the musical she wears a cap and gown and gives a commencement address. These theatrical moments refer to performances that affect a lasting change. But Broadway surely doesn't intend to do the same thing as the performance of a wedding or a graduation, right? The word performative, and we hear that so often wrongly to imply a spectacle of fakery, derives from a different sort of Harvard spectacle from Elle Woods' graduation. J.L. Austin's lectures titled How to Do Things with Words. The linguist J.L. Austin popularized this term for a performative speech act. We actually do these all the time. You know them already. The classic example is class dismissed. A performative speech act is something that affects what it says. So we might think about how we use performative speech acts in Christian ritual all the time. I baptize you. This is my body. I take you as my husband. The words affect what they say. A performative utterance does what it says it does. The class can only be dismissed once the teacher says the phrase, class dismissed, and by saying those words, the class is dismissed. I like to explain ritual actions using this sort of performance theory because it reminds everyone from the beginning, whether they believe in the Christian story or not, that sacraments are not the same thing as magic spells. Any grace in a baptism is going to come from God, not because the words were spoken correctly. But we get to see how such words and actions can change the world by analyzing our words as performances that affect that change. One of the sticky parts about J.L. Austin's theory of performative utterance and the embrace of performance theory across all sorts of academic disciplines is that he confusingly says that an actor on stage does not make a performative utterance. That's because as an actor, you don't make a change in the world by performing as your character. There's a gap between the world of the play and the world in which we live. By distancing performativity from theatrical drama, the words performance, performative, and performativity start to replicate the anti-theatrical bias, in my opinion. I think that's certainly shaped some of our conversation about performativity in the world today if we think it only signals a flashy charlatan. I'm curious when we collectively decided that fictional stories can't reveal anything true. Witnessing the spectacle of a marriage on stage, perhaps when Maria and Captain Von Trapp climb every mountain, it might actually show us something true about human relationships, the complications of married life, the overflowing beauty of love. The actors don't need to be literally married in order to hold up that theatrical mirror and show us a way to see and ask questions about the meaning of love in our human lives. Believe it or not, I think we can say the very same thing about Elle Woods and her Harvard regalia. The blonde fashion merchandising major from California does not commence onto a successful career as a lawyer in Massachusetts in order for us to feel moved by her accomplishments, inspired by Elle's integrity, delighted by her feminist literal flipping of the script to propose to Emmett Forrest in the middle of her valedictorian speech. And look, friends, that shouldn't be a spoiler for you. Elle Woods, Emmett Forrest, both names have trees. Musically, though, this moment is rather brilliant because Elle's graduation proposal triggers a reprise of Legally Blonde's opening number. Oh my God, you guys! The spectacle of cap and gown show audiences the various ways in which understanding has changed over the course of the musical. The performance of our personality, whether visually through hair color or culturally in something like a Valley Girl accent or even certain sets of values, those performances determine very little about what a person can or should be able to do in the world. Perhaps that's why when Elle steps up to the podium to give her valedictory speech, she's introduced with a citation to Polonius' speech from Hamlet. "To thine own self be true, and it must follow as night the day. Thou canst not be false to any man." How deliciously ironic that this introduction for an actor who may very well be wearing a blonde wig and certainly is not now a doctor of law from Harvard. At least unless Harvard opened a law campus on Broadway that gives out degrees 8 times a week. See, Broadway shows and amateur productions are a step removed from the context that signals a community's intention. And intention may be one of the key differences between what we call a real wedding, it's still a spectacle, and what we call a fake or theatrical wedding. It's still a spectacle. Have you ever made it to that awkward moment of a wedding rehearsal where it's time for the bride and groom to practice their vows? What happens if we say those words in a different context? They're in front of witnesses, friends, and family. There's probably an officiant there. Did someone become married because of the words that they said? Or is it because there's some sort of love or care or world of context that shows a difference between a real husband and wife sharing words on a stage in front of an audience and a theatrical husband and wife performing all the motions of a ritual marriage, but as part of storytelling? The image on the screen, of course, is from the number Sunrise Sunset from Fiddler on the Roof, which in many cases turns out to be a staple at actual weddings. And it's not as if a bride would walk down the aisle to a wedding march from a Wagner opera at all. No, bum, bum, ba-bum. We don't need to assume that spectacles about faith and God simply by being spectacular aim to deceive. With a little bit of interpretive stretching, they might even reveal something about God to us. So does Broadway have a theology, an understanding of the divine? I want to suggest to you that plays and musicals do contest and confront the meaning of God's revelation in our contemporary life. But I think it's important to distinguish looking for just some religious symbols on Broadway and thinking theologically. I want to argue that there's a big difference between when commercial theater cites some religious symbols or images and moments when commercial theater performs the symbol of God. The first instance is a citation that should remind us of Elle's graduation. You see actual caps and gowns, and they're to remind us that what's being staged is a graduation ceremony. What the play does instead, however, might be to invite us to dream, to interpret, to think about what God means in our life. There's even the symbol of God in this example from Legally Blonde, isn't there? Those gathered start to sing, "Oh my God, you guys," but such an invocation is not intended as a hymn of praise to the divine in the same way we might sing God's praise in this space. Yet the beauty of Elle's proposal to Emmett does sing out a reference to God. Did the ladies of Delta Nu finally come to understand God in this particular moment? I doubt it. But we might think about God's presence when someone flips the script or upends cultural expectations because God was invoked at the end of Legally Blonde. The same can be said for all the plays and musicals that stage religious themes or scriptural ideas. I'm thinking about Jesus Christ Superstar or Sister Act or Our Town or even Spamalot. Broadway shows are chock full of religious performances. But I doubt that they were intended to remind us of God's presence. In fact, I'm playing with ways in which things are similar and different at the same time. Think about this moment from the beginning of John Patrick Shanley's play Doubt that premiered in 2004. This play about the sexual abuse crisis. Why have so many church communities turned to this parable play to process their questions about God that emerged from a compromised institution? This play won the Pulitzer Prize, and it begins with a sermon. Here's a selection. What do you do when you're not sure? That's the topic of my sermon today. You look for God's direction and can't find it. Last year, When President Kennedy was assassinated, who among us did not experience the most profound disorientation, despair? It was a time of people sitting together, bound together by a common feeling of hopelessness. But think of that. Your bond with your fellow human beings was your despair. It was a public experience shared by everyone in our society. It was awful, but we were in it together. How much worse is it then for the lone man, the lone woman, stricken by a private calamity? For those so afflicted, only God knows their pain, their secret, the secret of their alienating sorrow. And when such a person, as they must, howls to the sky, to God, "Help me!" what if no answer comes? Silence. There are those of you in the church today who know exactly the crisis of faith I describe. I want to say to you, doubt can be a bond as powerful and sustaining as certainty. When you are lost, you are not alone. End quote. That speech comes from a priest who walks out clad in green and gold vestments, directly addressing his congregaudience in the Manhattan Theater Club. Before any context of story or plot, Father Flynn speaks as if the given circumstances of a Sunday homily. But this first sermon also interacts with the play's performance context. Shanley has Father Flynn set the events of doubt in the fall of 1964, after Kennedy's assassination and in the middle of the Second Vatican Council. That was an event in the Catholic Church that is most well known for the change from an exclusive use of the Latin language for the liturgy towards the use of the vernacular, among many other updating or aggiornamento changes to Catholic thinking and thought to catch up with the signs of the times. Flynn addresses themes of God's direction, the shared and public nature of emotionally charged religious experience, theology's affliction and pain, at the secret of an alienating sorrow. In fact, Flynn seems to recapitulate a theology of the cross and Holy Saturday in God's cry of dereliction into silence. Quote, "When such a person as they must howls to the sky, to God, 'Help me,' what if no answer comes? Silence." End quote. Doubt premiered in 2004, only a few years after the September 11th attacks and the first reports of widespread clergy sexual abuse by the Boston Globe. Flynn announces, quote, "Your bond with your fellow human beings was your despair," to an audience, a room full of still rattled Catholics and their neighbors, still anxious New Yorkers and their neighbors. The play happens without an intermission, and the second act, if you will, might be where audience members gather together to debate, discuss, and discern their own faith or doubt in Father Flynn. Plays care little about our assumption that audiences are supposed to be passive, watching. Actually, we know that audiences have the power to interrupt whether they intend to or not. The conundrum reminds us of one of the great ethical maxims of Broadway: silence those phones and electronic devices. We have to make the same announcement before church services, don't we? I'm particularly fond of the occasional reminder to unwrap candy before the start of the performance. I also sometimes wish we'd say that before church services too, because of the strong implication that I would have candy. The goal seems fair enough. There are rules about creating an environment for shivers of excitement, wonder, and applause. But our assumptions that it will be dark and quiet are historical. The Columbia musicologist Lydia Gare calls this assumption that we're going to gather in quiet in the dark to wait for the great revelation on stage the Beethoven paradigm. Broadway's version, I think, might well be named for the actress Patti Lupone. The sound of a phone call or light emitted from a road text message midway through a performance can rupture what Lupone calls a theatrical experience. But rather than tell you about it, I'll let Patti tell you for herself. Aaron, whenever you're ready.
Very satisfying moment in the theater. We all know how annoying it can be when someone's texting during a show. The actors hate it most of all. So Broadway legend Patti Lupone took matters into her own hands, snatching away the offending phone. ABC's Cecilia Vega has the story.
Hi, everyone. She is a Tony-winning queen of Broadway.
I know it.
But this morning, Patti Lupone is starring in a new role, cell phone police.
She was texting through the entire first act, and she was sitting right there in the second seat. It was, everybody can see, look how teeny this theater is. And she was oblivious to everybody except for herself and her phone.
The legendary star reenacting the real-life drama on stage last night.
It was right here, it was this lady right here, and I just grabbed the phone and went, oh.
Lupone snatching a phone from an audience member mid-performance on Wednesday.
I feel bad for the people that come here to have a theatrical experience, and it's ruined.
That audience giving Lupone a standing ovation on Twitter. Way to go, Patti. When the lights came back on, an usher returned the phone. But she isn't the only etiquette officer. Watch as last week an audience member at the Broadway show Hand to God hops onto the stage and tries to plug his phone into a fake outlet. But from a Maroon 5 concert to Prince Harry, stars are saying enough is enough, and Lupone is taking matters and people's cell phones into her own hands. A lot of people, too, right now are saying bravo.
Well, I wish they'd just turn the phone off. I don't want the bravo or the apology.
For Good Morning America, Cecilia Vega, ABC News, New York.
She's right. It's so simple. Just turn the phone off for that time.
There's really something for her to walk right up there and take it away, though.
That's why I text on my watch now. Right. Nobody can take it away.
She can't rip it.
I'm delighted by that little story about Patti Lupone for 3 reasons. The first is how wonderful would it be to watch an actor break character to take a phone from an audience member and prove we're all in the room together. I just think that's fun. But the second thing is Lupone gives her theory of a theatrical experience, this being taken away from our ordinary sense of the world to be caught up in the world of the play. I don't know if that's that different from the way we ordinarily talk about a religious experience. And in fact, Lupone's need for there to be no pollution of the theater space from the outside recalls the anthropologist Mary Douglas's notion that religion is about establishing taboos that protect purity from danger. In that clip, there was a reference to the show Hand to God, a dark comedy romp about a demonic puppet terrorizing a less-than-righteous church in Texas. It's the exact sort of play Augustine and Tertullian warned us about last night. And I think this clip from 2015 actually gives us a nice snapshot in history to notice how frequently God shows up in Broadway shows. There's another play, David Jaberbaum's popular social media account, The Tweet of God, translated into an evening of theater featuring Jim Parsons as the Almighty himself. If those comedies about God don't strike your fancy, there was a musical about the origin of the hymn Amazing Grace that concluded after curtain call with the entire audience rising to sing along with this beloved hymn. The revival of The Color Purple took audiences by storm, and most reviews describe this as a play that will take you to church. And you could catch a fascinating revival of Fiddler on the Roof, deeply invested in that show's nostalgia for a community in diaspora. There were spectacles of God all over Hamilton, or Deaf West Theater's production of Spring Awakening, where a spectacle of a sacrament happened on stage, and members of the cast walked through the audience in cassock and surplice, swinging actual incense. All the while, you could still catch the Book of Mormon or see that mega musical and its references to religion, Les Miserables. That's just a short rundown of one Broadway season. And indeed, it can be easy to dismiss Broadway as a resource for theology. But how do those plays understand God? Broadway is a rich and serious place to think about how God and questions about God happen outside the boundaries of religious institutions like churches, universities, and publishing houses. You know, some producers may want to highlight how Broadway makes a different sort of narrative about God from those religious authorities. Still others might want to highlight how Broadway might dilute or misunderstand the core truths of the Christian story. But I want to make a structural point to you all. Popular shows reveal God in public for a public audience. It brings a whole host of differing assumptions to their interpretation of the symbol of God. Where you sit influences what you see. Some members of the audience may practice a particular religious tradition or have specialized theological training. Others may have little to no experience of a faith community or any interest in thinking deeply about God, but nonetheless see a show saturated with symbols of the divine. Broadway theater makers can't make any assumptions about their audience. They've not already been initiated into the rites and mysteries of a show. Instead, God decides to reveal God's self in public and waits to be found. Here are just 3 examples. In the musical Fiddler on the Roof, there is a wonderfully famous moment where the character Tevye turns and says, "Dear God, I know you've made many, many poor people, and I realize, of course, it is no great shame to be poor, but it's no great honor either. So would it have been so hard if I could have had a small fortune?" He then goes on to sing, "If I Were a Rich Man." Here's my question for you. Imagine a Broadway stage and a Broadway theater. Where is God? Like my students, you might answer that it's the fiddler sitting on a roof, this symbol of tradition. You might say that God emerges in the love of a community. All true. But I ask a literal question. If Tevye addresses the balcony and says, "Dear God," as he is told to say to heaven in all of the stage directions, perhaps that means the audience is playing the character of God, watching the events of a faithful community unfold on stage, suffering with them during times of trial, thinking, how could this story be told differently? And walking with this community to a new context in America. It's an interesting question about where we think God is in our world. Surely everywhere. But perhaps, just perhaps, in Fiddler on the Roof, part of the role of God is played by the audience. Think then about Les Miserables, a wonderful story about a group of students who rise up in uprising against the French. There's a barricade, it's a big budget musical, it's a lot of fun. But have you ever noticed at the very beginning, Jean Valjean takes a set of silver candlesticks from a priest and steals them. And there's a moment of forgiveness where this priest or archdeacon, depending on the production and how they're costumed, sings to Valjean, "But remember this, my brother, see in this some higher plan. You must take this precious silver and become an honest man. By the witness of the martyrs, by the passion and the blood, you must take this precious silver. I have bought your soul for God." Now, if you know the show, that's a very interesting moment. This notion of a gift that buys a soul for God, a kind of substitutionary atonement theory, is actually the melody of Marius's song, "Empty Chairs at Empty Tables." I think there's enough room to have a theological reading of this as a moment of kenosis, the idea that God empties God's self in order to bring the world God's love. There's an interesting way in which Les Mis shows an act of generosity and forgiveness. There's another show that has a profound moment of generosity and forgiveness. You might have noticed if you've seen Hamilton. Now, I could comment about this show's way of retelling American history, but I'm slightly more interested, in fact, in the spectacles of forgiveness that happen at the end of the second act. Hamilton, who has betrayed his wife, Eliza, finds himself, with the cast watching, forgiven in a striking number that brings at least myself and perhaps everyone else in the audience sometimes to tears. Now, there are lots of problematic things about Hamilton that we can talk about in Q&A if folks would like. But the point I'm interested in thinking about this show theologically is its theme about history having its eyes on you. Who's watching? In Hamilton, there are a number of musical themes that recapitulate throughout the show that we hear in "I'm Not Going to Throw Away My Shot." the number when the world turned upside down about the Patriot victory over the British at the Battle of Yorktown. And then later, in the second act, when Washington's tune, History Has Its Eyes on You, returns at the very end of the show in what might be an eschatological vision of the afterlife. There's an interesting point about Hamilton. It's not titled Alexander Hamilton. And our show's narrator shifts in the last number from the Secretary of the Treasury to Eliza, who suggests that she is writing herself back into the narrative, a notion of history seen in love that might bring the world together. There was a lot of speculation by scholars and fans of Hamilton when the recording premiered on Disney Plus over the summer about Philippa Sue's choice to gasp in amazement at the very end of the show. I suggest to you that a Christian theological reading might understand that moment as a way of seeing the vision of God. A vision of God that I've already suggested might be played by the audience watching. And so that's perhaps where Broadway's theology leaves us, on a quest to find God in and with one another. And I think that's the real point of thinking theologically with the help of pop culture like Broadway shows. You, whether you and I, or you meaning God, will be found, but perhaps not in the way you expected to be found or how you expected to be found. I won't give away any of the plot to the musical Dear Evan Hansen, but I do want to end with its powerful and stirring anthem, You Will Be Found, because it concretizes something deeply true about what I think about the symbol of God on Broadway. The lyrics to the song go something like this. Even when the dark comes crashing through, when you need a friend to carry you, when you're broken on the ground, you will be found. So let the sun come streaming in, because you'll reach up and you'll rise again. If you only look around, you will be found. The heart of the gospel remains God's promise that you will be found. That despite living in a world that suffers from pain and plague, despite the dark that's crashing through our compromised institutions and unfinished quests for justice in our society, even when we feel broken and abandoned, you will be found. In the words of another show tune, this time from Sondheim's Into the Woods, no one is alone. In fact, that's the direction this song takes. Out of the shadows, the morning is breaking, and all is new. All is new. It's filling up the empty, and suddenly I see all is new. All is new. You are not alone. You are not alone. This affirmation repeats over and over again. You are not alone. You are not alone. You are not alone. I'm enamored by its twofold theological claim. You are not alone, addressed as a prayer to God, reminds us that God is not lonely. God doesn't need the world in order to be God. Remember that creatio continua theme? The world's radically dependent on the Creator, not the other way around. But God has nonetheless willed to be in an eternal relationship of love with God's beloved creatures. The God of love has not abandoned the world to its own devices. God wills to love the world in such a way that our human life might even become meaningful to God. Because as we know in Emmanuel, God pitches a tent among us, walks alongside us, loves with us, knowing in the intimate and profound way that only an incarnate God could what it means to be human. This is the God who cries out from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" A God who even knows the experience of God forsakenness that so many humans experience in our world. And so God promises again and again that you are not alone. The song's bridge features this remarkable image of the resurrection. In the morning, all is new. And in this illumination, in this interpretation in the light, perhaps a revelation, perhaps merely of a good show tune, suddenly I see that all is new. What would it mean then, at the end of a show, to look around the house that we share, both the seats in a packed Broadway auditorium or the house of our one planet that we can call a common home, and see that all is new? The lights will come up, it will be time to go home, but we would see that we already were home. And we now have a chance to see one another differently, maybe correctly for the first time, to be the one who is the friend that carries and consoles the weeping. We might start to experience one another in such a way that we might really live the deep truth hidden in the very last line of Les Miserables, the last thing we hear. For to love another person is to see the face of God. Thank you.
Thank you. While he takes a break, just for a moment, think about any questions you might have, or if you are part of our streaming audience, go ahead and send those questions in, and we'll give them to Dr. Gillespie to do as he will. Just waiting for some sound.
As we keep saying, this is the risk of something live, right? It's the delight of being together in a room as things go a little differently than planned, but that's always fine. I'm also happy to just repeat your question so our folks online will be able to hear you. Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if you've seen a movement away from that in more current Broadway productions where the overlap with religious themes may be more due to the fact that the art form is wrestling with deep human questions, which is also what religious institutions do. And so there's just sort of a almost unintentional overlap. So we can find religious themes in these plays, but they're not intentional. So do you see that as a trend over time?
That was a wonderfully formulated comment question. For those of you who might not have been able to hear online, it was a great comment reflecting on how classic shows like Fiddler on the Roof or The Sound of Music, like I shared, seem to have overt and obvious and intended references to religion. But then we have been looking at some more contemporary shows and musicals that seem to have more unintentional or implicit references to religion. And correct me if I get the question wrong, but I think part of your question is, do I see a trend in this change? And my response to that would be that I don't see a change in how obvious religion is in plays and musicals. I see a shift in the sort of religious questions they're asking. So I think that the classic shows like The Sound of Music or Fiddler on the Roof were emphasizing representation, the idea of a community that might either be a subculture in the United States or something that's less well known to the world. are staging a show to raise awareness about these particular stories and groups. There's a reason, for instance, why Fiddler on the Roof is so immediately recognizable as something beloved and as a symbol of Jewish communities, even though internal to Jewish studies in the academy and to many Jewish critics, the show is actually a stereotypical send-up of a fictional past, a kind of nostalgia for a world in the old country that never was. So depending on who you ask, these classic representations are even themselves somewhat implicit. But the trend I'm noticing in more recent productions is that theological or religious symbols are pushing back against religious institutions. Rather than being a representation or a sharing or a show and tell moment, they're asking uncomfortable questions that churches don't often like to ask. That's what you'd see in plays like Hand to God, which shows us a very corrupt evangelical church in Texas, so corrupt that there's a demonic puppet that starts to colonize it, or even the Book of Mormon, where religion is not thrown out with the bathwater, but the choices of institutions are questions about whether they're living up to their own commitments. It was a great question. Thank you for that.
There's a connection to that last point going back further. If you look at Damn Yankees and the character of Applegate, who is the devil, he's the smartest guy in the show. He speaks the best. He wears the best clothes. Mm-hmm. He's the one everybody wants to be. He's the devil.
Yeah.
Can you repeat that?
Sure. It was a great reference to that classic musical Damn Yankees, where the character of Applegate, who wears these fancy suits and seems to be this really alluring, attractive character, is the devil. Damn Yankees is actually one of the best examples of the worries about theater from the early church I shared yesterday, where this notion that if the Yankees want to win, they have to sell their soul to the demonic to be good enough to win the pennant. It's a great little musical send-off of the Senators. That's so sorry. That's fair. I set myself up for that one, didn't I? The Senators have to sell their soul in order to beat those damn Yankees. But in this moment, I think it's such a great example of the way shows have always raised this sort of questions, because we get a religious symbol in order to think about greed and ambition and worry. And I don't know about you, but who's got the pain when they do the mambo? It's a wonderful number, and it continues to raise our questions for us today about who we go to for relief, where we're seeking a solution to our presumed problems. Damn Yankees is a fantastic example, Chris. Thanks for that.
Well, you gotta have heart.
It's true. You gotta have heart. In a future version of the Spectacles talk, I think I can slip in a number of great jokes that fit perfectly. Thank you for that.
I see no questions online from the online audience. Oh, here's one. Here we go.
Ask and ye shall receive, Anne.
Yes. Is there such a thing as bad theater? How do we navigate a theatrical experience that misleads or misinforms?
That is a rich and wonderful question. Thank you to whoever asked it. So there's two ways that bad can mean in this question about whether there's bad theater, and what do we do with all sorts of shows that mislead and misinform. The first way that we think about bad is whether the show was any fun to watch, whether it was an enjoyable evening out. And in that sense, there are certainly bad plays. I don't know if you've ever seen one. I've been to a few myself, where they're just not wonderful manifestations of this great art form. But the more profound part of this question is how we tell whether a show is leading us astray, or whether it's helping us to see one another illuminated as we are in the light of God as loved. And I think that's a really difficult question. So my answer is twofold, and at parts it might sound like I'm a ninja dodging it, but I mean every word. We're not going to know what shows are good or bad if we become anxious about having a conversation about whether the stories we are telling are reflecting the story we want to tell about the world. I'm going to say that again. We're never going to be able to figure out if a show is good or bad, whether it does harm or it does good, if we remain anxious about having a conversation about whether such shows exist or not, whether they match the story of truth we're trying to tell. So the first step to figure out if a show might be harmful or bad, in my opinion, is to be willing to have conversations about it. That's a project we're embarking on at Sacred Heart University to think about whether Othello, one of Shakespeare's plays, can be performed in the present, given its toxic relationship to questions of race. The next question, or part of this question, is whether shows might mislead or malform us to think about the world wrongly. That one's a lot trickier, and I think my answer would be everything in the world is a little risky. It's just a question of how much risk tolerance we want to have for shows that seem to get it wrong. My suggestion? Communities should have conversations about whether certain shows or things are doing harm in the present, and if they're doing harm, to stop. However, we shouldn't be afraid of storytelling, in my opinion, because we have to be able to push back against the structures of power or assumptions that we have. And theater that might come across as malinforming, we might wind up not being able to tell stories about doubt or mistake. That's a great question.
Okay, here's one more. This is a St. Augustine quote regarding Eucharist. Be what you see, receive what you are. Is there a parallel of experiencing theater/drama?
What a wonderfully rich question. For the person who asked this, I either feel warmed that you would quote the end of my lecture from yesterday, or I would invite you to make sure you watch the lecture from yesterday, because I arrive at Augustine's wonderful sermon on seeing and becoming the Eucharist as my closing moment. I want to provocatively argue that when there are spectacles of God on stage, they might be revelations just as worthwhile and transformational as the revelations we see in a church. I would suggest a theology of sacrament, then, would invite us to be able to tell the difference between those things we see that we are called to become, that we know we can trust, the sacraments of God's church, and those sacramental moments on stage that might press us to live in the world differently today. What I've tried to suggest tonight, though, is that God is going to be bigger than any category. So whether it's a sacramental spectacle in a church that we know for sure is a visible sign of invisible reality conferring grace, or like in the musical revival of Spring Awakening in 2015, when there is a sung credo and the entirety of the company receives what appears to be the Eucharist, while, as I mentioned, members of the cast dressed in acolyte costumes with real incense walk up and down the aisles. If that moment moves someone in the audience to think about God or sacrament or what it means to be the body of Christ a little differently, I want to say that's God working in the world in an unexpected way. Thanks for that great question.
Any more? Anywhere? Here we go.
The examples you give are singular encapsulated Broadway shows, but should we judge TV series that go on season after season in a different light?
That's a great question. I really like that.
Repeat
The
it.
question was, I've talked about Broadway shows, and I hope you see by extension amateur performance, because American theater is not just what happens in New York, it's all the great traveling productions, and in my opinion, even better, local church and school productions that bring stories to communities with people we recognize. The question is whether I've focused on Broadway shows, but are there any connections between what I've said and television and maybe even film? It's a great question for two reasons. The first reason it's a great question is because I think if we go to a movie or film set, we're going to see a lot of the same strategies of actors performing. So anytime we think about theater and theology from the perspective of an actor, we can certainly apply those ideas to film and TV. Where I want to suggest that they're very, 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 very different is film and television can be experienced alone, because the medium is the camera and screen. So logically, it's possible to watch a TV show by yourself or go see a movie by yourself. It is logically impossible for theater to happen alone. And I think that makes all the difference for how these stories mean. I'll use the sacrament example. to point it out. If we see church things in a TV show, we can certainly think about them as representations of the church, but they aren't going to hit our body in the same way as if we see church things on a stage in a room with others. It's so similar because we have the same body in both contexts. I think we'll ask different theological questions based on how we receive it. Last point, though, and why it's such a good one, is you should not hear anything I've just said to say that there isn't also a wonderful way to do theology in cinema or theology in television. And I think that there are very, very rich religious and theological questions being asked by all the TV shows and movies that are out right now. And if you want to take any of the tools I've given you about spectacle or about how to interpret and apply them to your favorite TV show or a great movie, you'd be in wonderful company. The same might be said for literature or any of the arts or music. It's a great question. Thank you for that.
On that note, here's another question for you. One of my favorite shows is Slings and Arrows, which very lovingly shows the way that the lifestyle of an actor can breed a sort of mercurial selfishness. Why are actors like that? And what sort of worries should we have about the sort of performers the church is making us into?
This is a rich question about a wonderful Canadian television program that I recommend to you. And to whoever asked this question, worrying about actors being self-centered and mercurial, I say simply, cheer up, you melancholy Dane. We have an assumption that actors are self-centered, right? We tend to worry that those who perform and become a celebrity become obsessed with themselves as opposed to others. We certainly don't want to take all of my references to theology that I've applied to the church and turn Christianity into a group of actors so proud of their knowledge of God's script that they're now going to go and perform it and convince the world of their own righteousness. I surely hope that's not the case. But I think one of the reasons we have this assumption about actors as theater people is because we recognize in actors our own love of approval and applause. And I think it's very easy to scapegoat actors as those who become self-obsessed because playing for laughs or doing something simply because it makes a group of people happy is what actors do for a living. I think that's actually one of the ways that theater holds the mirror up to nature and reveals something about our own human condition. We're all drawn to applause. We all want to make someone happy, I hope. And because of that, there's a tendency to turn our attention from delighting in applause as a gift, as a response, as a way of saying, thank you for showing me the world a different way, as we share with actors at the end of a show, and turn it into a confirmation of our own glory. What's underneath this question in lots of ways is the fact that as much as I want to praise theater and say it's wonderful and fantastic, and as much as I want to praise the church and say it's always wonderful and fantastic, neither of those sentences are true 100% of the time. And I think what theater does is invite us to sit with the uncomfortable reality that we're never going to be fully sure if we're doing it right, but hopefully we can look around and see others that we love and know that we're on this journey trying to play out our role for others together. It's a really great question. I think I know who asked it.
Okay, I believe that's all of our questions. I just want to say I think this Dillard Forum has been spectacular, just one for a real jewel. And it will be archived on our Trinity website in the near future, tomorrow or sometime this week, in case any of you missed last night's lecture or if you want to revisit what we've learned here. This has been a joy, a lot of fun. It's just been great to see you connect the dots between philosophy, theology, theater, and religion. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Okay. Charlie is on his way to Connecticut tonight, starting his journey.
It's true, but I'm now going to do my last joke as planned, which is There's No Business Like Show Business yesterday, and there's that great line about actors always wanting to steal their extra bow, so watch it happen live.
Okay.